Okay, hi again, everyone, and welcome to our first session on changing social understandings in response to crisis. In this session, we'll have three presentations. The first by Susanna Trnka and Sharyn Davies is entitled Blowing Bubbles, COVID-19, New Zealand's Bubble Metaphor and the Limits of Households as Sites of Responsibility and Care. In our second presentation, we'll hear from Heather Mello and her talk on innovation diffusion, social capital, and mask mobilization, culture change during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in our third presentation, we'll hear from Milkie and her presentation, Changing Times, New Sources of Parenting Stress and the Shifting Meanings of Time with and for Children. Just a quick technical note that I have temporarily disabled chat just so that it doesn't distract our presenters. But when everyone is presented and we'll be presenting in order, then we'll open it up for discussion and question and answer, and I will enable chat again at that time. So you'll be able to post your questions or to raise your hand in the chat and we'll be able to call on you. So for our first presentation today, unfortunately, Susanna and Sharyn couldn't be with us because of time zone differences. One thing I've become acutely aware of when organizing this conference is time zone differences. And unfortunately, they couldn't join us, but they have submitted a video presentation. So I'm going to try to share that now.
Hello, everyone. Greetings from New Zealand and from Australia. My name is Susanna Trnka. I'm at the University of Auckland.
Kia ora, my name is Sharyn Davies and I have until recently been in New Zealand and just moved to Monash University in Melbourne.
And we're going to be speaking today to our chapter in the book, which is called Blowing Bubbles, COVID-19, New Zealand's Bubble Metaphor and the Limits of Households as Sites of Responsibility and Care. And we wanted to start, I know that New Zealand is very often in the news for its incredibly successful approach to COVID, but we wanted to start with just some basic background. So the first case of COVID was reported in New Zealand on the 28th of February, 2020. As of the latest statistics we have, as of the 29th of March, 2021, we've had a total of 2,493 cases and a total of 26 people have died from the virus. If we look back to 2020, on the 21st of March, the country went into a level 4 lockdown, which lasted just over a month. And as part of this process of being locked down, we all had to get into bubbles. And that's what we want to focus on with you today, is this phenomena of the bubble. So during the first and to date the only nationwide lockdown, which lasted from March until May 2020, the New Zealand government rolled out the concept of bubbles as the unique site of social interaction whilst in lockdown. Notably, it did so with very little government or even public discussion of what it might mean to belong to a bubble, much less to consciously craft one anew. This was mentioned a little bit by the government in terms of the need for safe havens for victims of domestic violence or other people who might need to flee their bubbles. But beyond this, there really wasn't much discussion of the actual dynamics of what it would mean to be part of a bubble. Now, the mass media was very quick to step in, filling our imaginations with bubbles, generally bubbles composed of heteronormative two-parent families who were busily playing board games when they weren't exercising together in the living room or filling the kitchen with the aroma of freshly baked bread. Clearly, this vision, while initially publicly embraced by many, was not broadly achievable. So in our chapter, what we look at, amongst other things, is what such visions assume, what gets left out, and who ends up having to pick up the pieces, either by finding themselves compelled to break their bubble, i.e. to break lockdown regulations, to achieve some semblance of face-to-face, human-to-human support, or to suffer within one. This includes, there's several different categories of people, but some of the most common people who struggled through were students who were flatting together, who may have very little in common beyond the shared roof above their heads, or seasonal workers who are in job-related accommodation. In situations where human contact, including care relations, were restricted to one's bubble mates, and there was even the assumption that each bubble could have a designated shopper, i.e. one person to handle all of the finances, plus the logistics of purchasing groceries, some people found their bubble relations were severely strained. So what followed was, unsurprisingly perhaps, attempts by many New Zealanders to negotiate bubble restrictions, often within the spirit of attempting to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. Flatmates came together to discuss who amongst them would be allowed to have a partner sleep over when, at alert level 3, bubbles opened up to a single outside visitor. But sometimes the compromise of who would be allowed in was too much to bear, and a single visitor became in reality 3 or 4 individual flatmates' partners. At other times, sticking to the rules led to intense acrimony, particularly among divorced or separated parents who found themselves juggling children back and forth between households that often included other step-parents with their offspring similarly moving from one household to another. And people were trying to coordinate this not just in terms of the practical logistics, but also while making their own determinations about the possible dangers of chain transmission. In some places, neighbors who knew one another and determined the risk to be low held street parties, sometimes drinking and communicating with each other from the ends of their individual driveways. In other sites, family relations unraveled when siblings fought over which one of their households would be opened up to contain elderly parents. Whatever they determined, and however they determined it, many of the New Zealanders who we spoke with throughout the course of our research, both during the first lockdown and subsequently throughout the crisis, noted the carefulness with which they generally determined how, when, and for whom they might open up their bubbles. Decision-making was rarely off the cuff, but most often drew upon an intricate weighing up of the competing responsibilities that people felt pulled them in multiple directions. Bubble regulations were used to regulate interpersonal proximities, but while the regulations were often taken extremely seriously, our research revealed that regulations were just one of many considerations that Kiwis had to contend with whilst they lived through lockdown.
So one of the really powerful things that emerged from New Zealand's negotiation of bubbles, we found was the power of the metaphor. And so people began thinking in terms of a bubble. It became a way of negotiating all sorts of everyday activities to make sure that people preserved the integrity of their bubble. And we saw in that previous cartoon that the man is saying to presumably his parents, "I'll just pop over." But you can see the two discrete bubbles, and you know that by his actions, he would not only pop or burst his own bubble, but also burst the bubble of his elderly parents, thereby, this idea of cross-contamination and not keeping each other safe. And so the metaphor became a really powerful way by which people were able to shape their lives. And in shaping that through the bubbles, another key kind of trope that emerged in New Zealand was being kind. So it wasn't that you needed to keep the integrity of your own bubble intact for yourself. You also had to be kind and think about others. So there was a really strong narrative pushed at all levels, from the Prime Minister down, to make sure that we're being kind to each other in our everyday life. So we found that the bubble metaphor was quite productive, and it emerged very early on in the New Zealand experience of COVID, and was subsequently taken up in other places, in other countries. But other places also had different metaphors, so sheltering in place or shielding or providing a barrier. But in many ways, those terms didn't evoke the same kind of productiveness that a bubble metaphor could have. In a sense, the bubble metaphor let people be, socially, physically distant, but also a bubble can expand, it can contract, it can sometimes, enclose others to enable other people to join that bubble or for bubbles to emerge. And now in the next slide, we will make some comments just on maintaining that bubble. So policies were put in place very quickly on about establishing the bubble. So in effect, the bubble should be your household. So whoever you lived with, wherever you lived, that was to be your bubble. And that had to be put in place very quickly because of the nature of COVID. But it quite quickly emerged that a lot of people aren't necessarily living happily, all well, within a self-contained nuclear household bubble. And so policies quickly had to be developed about how people could leave unsafe bubbles if there was domestic violence or other issues of safety and security, and also how those bubbles could be expanded to enable people to provide care without bursting the bubble. So expanded bubbles, if two people lived alone, they could form a single bubble. Workers might form a work bubble. So ambulance drivers might have maintained a bubble at work and not actually come home. So there had to be quick thinking about how these bubbles could be maintained. And now on the next slide, we'll make a few comments just on care. The bubble metaphor then showed the limits of care provided within households. And as Susanna has alluded to already, that these became quite problematic for people who were flatting, who don't normally provide economic care or other forms of support for childcare if that doesn't all happen within a single abode. For many families, for Māori and Pacific especially, there are often care commitments that go beyond a nuclear family, and so these were in many ways limited with the bubble. And how people should love and care for their bubble. So we can see here one of the messages that was on the national television, TVNZ, you know, be kind, stay safe, and love your bubble. But this wasn't always necessary. So I think we've got a slide here where we'll be summing up, and I'll pass back to Susanna for that.
So when we assess the policy, we obviously find that there's positives and negatives to the bubble policy as it was put in place. Amongst the positives was the sense that there was generally clear and coherent instructions. And given, in fact, the sharp turnaround in which bubble policies were pulled together, this is quite remarkable. The negatives, I think, we've pretty much laid out in our presentation. But so what do we do with all of this? One thing that we try to put forward in our consideration is various features that we might want to think about in the future if we have to revisit bubble policies. The first is the question of safety within a bubble. So it's fine to say, be kind, love your bubble, but obviously that is not a situation that everyone is in. So beyond domestic violence, what are other issues of safety and how might we address them? A second key issue is economic relations within and across bubbles. So if people are not in economic units that necessarily map directly onto their bubble, what provisions can be made for them, particularly in the case of a long lockdown. So the first lockdown, level 3 and level 4, lasted 49 days. So that's quite a lengthy period. Affective ties in terms of people's interpersonal relationships with others and the need to take care of people who are not necessarily within your bubble. And then all of this sort of reflects around the issue of vulnerability as well, how people may be vulnerable within their bubble and may also feel vulnerability towards the possibility of breaking the bubble if need be. So the last thing we have for you, as we've come up to 1 year anniversary of the bubble policy being started in New Zealand, there's been a lot of interest in what have we learned from bubbles and where might bubbles take us in the future. So we actually wanted to finish with one of the media clips that reflects on this, the 1 year anniversary of lockdowns and bubbles and where have we come from then.
Thanks, Susanna. And you'll see Susanna starring in this, so I'll press play now.
Think about this day last year when we headed into our first level 4 COVID lockdown.
The 365 days since have taught us a lot about resilience, coping with change, and staying home. Researchers have actually been looking into the long-lasting effects of our lockdown and whether some of our changes in behaviour have actually been for the collective good. 1 year ago today, this is how life looked. The Prime Minister, of course, has told us to stay in our bubbles, and in just under 5 hours that'll happen. Oblivious that in the coming months, we'd be locked out from the rest of the world and forced to look within. We'd really get to know our housemates and our neighbours.
Our street's like the best street around.
We love the people we live with, and it's a really great community.
We'd work new words into our vocab.
Be kind,
Be kind,
be kind,
be kind,
be kind.
and learn the value of toilet paper. We'd have a lesson in hygiene. Happy birthday to you. And make it fashion. We learned a thing or two about patience and the power of giving.
Go for it, guys. Help yourselves.
1 year on, and daily life looks like this. And our new normal is our nation's armour.
And Dr. Susanna Trnka is one of the researchers. Great to talk to you. When it comes to lasting changes, are Kiwis different after the events of the last 12 months?
I think they're different in that they know that they can do this, that if we're called upon collectively to act, that we're able to do that. And obviously we saw that historically, but knowing that within the last year, and in some cases in Auckland quite recently, that we can act together, it's a great thing to know.
Do you think, though, that that sense of collective awareness and compassion has actually lasted 1 year on?
I think it's lasted in the sense that it's there as a reserve. I don't think it's something that we're necessarily enacting on a day-to-day level, but in the sense that we know we've done it before and we can do it again if we need to.
I think we all watched neighbourhoods and communities come together last year. Did they keep in touch?
Well, it's interesting because when we did our survey, people mainly spoke about the sort of collective sense of being part of a team or being part of a nation. And when they spoke about communities and neighborhoods, it was usually because they already had those interpersonal ties in existence there.
What was it that made people come together like they did?
I think it's probably not a very provocative answer, but when we did our survey, a lot of what they talked about was the government messaging. So people talked about the Prime Minister and what she had said, or Ashley Bloomfield. People referred to them by name, or they spoke just generally about the government and about the need to listen and take heed and interpret for themselves what the government messages were.
So on balance, do you think the positives of lockdown actually outweighed the negatives?
So a lot of the Asian respondents in our survey talked about racism. And we also heard from essential service workers who felt like they were stigmatized. But on balance, when you look across, the majority of people spoke about it as a positive experience, maybe not positive in terms of how you're feeling at the time, but in terms of doing the right thing.
It's fascinating stuff. Thanks, Susanna. Great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Great. So I want to thank Susanna and Sharyn for sharing that video with us, even though they couldn't be with us today. If you do have questions for them, feel free to send them to me in the private chat when that's enabled, a direct message to me, and I'd be happy to pass them along and put you in touch. In the meantime, I want to turn the floor over to our next presenter, Heather Mello, who will talk to us about mask mobilization. So Heather, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Michael. I really appreciate it. So I will go ahead and share my PowerPoint. My paper is about innovation diffusion, masks as an innovation, diffusing through social capital networks and the mobilization throughout society, resulting in a change, a cultural change, a material and behavioral change in the United States surrounding mask wearing. I performed this research. I used social media and newspapers to perform this research. I used a content analysis of 2 separate newspapers and Corpus Analysis, a digestive approach looking at aggregated language data in order to understand this, because I wasn't living in the United States at the time. I'm still not living in the United States. I'm living in Kazakhstan. And what prompted my research interest was living in a society that is more pro-mask during illness than the United States. I suppose China and maybe other Eastern Asian nations would be highly pro-mask, with Kazakhstan being more pro-mask than the United States. So I want to start with my final assertion. What is my final takeaway before I tell you how I kind of crafted this or figured this out? But the United States went from a country that didn't really wear masks, that was not a mask culture except for certain immigrant groups, And the reason that behavior happened was through widespread community mask making, organizing and distribution through formal and informal social networks in response to calls by authorities and public health experts. And I have pictures here of this so-called mask making army that was deployed by our government. And I'm also going to talk about, since we're talking about social networks and they don't always interact and they don't always see things the same way, at the same time as we had pro-mask networks rise, we also had anti-mask networks rise. And these were facilitated by their own networks and change agents, influential people in those networks, and less positive interaction with the pro-mask networks, either less interaction or less positive interaction. And of course, you know, American individualistic attitudes. This might also be talked about today during our Wild West presentation. So what was the catalyst for this change? Why? There have been pandemics before. There was the 1918 flu pandemic. We did see a lot of the same issues. You know, memory is short. People aren't always great students of history. And so this happened, and then we kind of forgot about masks in the United States. And we also had laws in the United States against mask wearing due to things like the KKK, racial groups, and trying to stop their action, and also criminal behavior where we didn't want masks to be worn. But the catalyst, the major catalyst for this was research and the findings of research. So initially, the government's message was, and this came from the United States Attorney General, Surgeon General, and other epidemiological experts, don't buy masks. They don't really help. And you should especially not buy masks because they're in short supply, and whatever we do have, we need them for our health workers and our essential workers. But as the research came around about COVID-19, we learned not only is it transmitted by droplets, it's also airborne. It's transmitted by, and so also research coming out of Asia. And, you know, this was a real pandemic that was spreading quite quickly. And so also sort of this different emphasis. So the message changed from don't buy masks for these reasons to masking can help prevent contraction on your own part, but also as you breathe out, it can help prevent others from contracting the virus. So sort of this altruistic social, from individualism to social, taking care of the social contract between humans and responsibility, and especially if the carrier is asymptomatic. And two bits of theory, and I won't go deep into these. I've got, I'm going to kill you with PowerPoint right here. But according to Rogers, innovation, diffusion of innovations, most individuals don't evaluate an innovation on science. They're more likely to evaluate an innovation based on how it's conveyed to them from individuals who are like themselves, but who have already adopted that innovation. So, we can throw statistics at people to try to get them to do things, but according to Rogers' specialist, this classic text on innovation diffusion, the influence of people that we admire and respect is more likely. And then Stretzer and Woolcock, as quoted in Cheng et al., talked about three forms of social networking that influence public health and trust: bonding, close network bonding by people who see themselves as similar; bridging, relationships between groups that may not be similar but that do interact; and then linking, the links between people and institutions of power. And these two factors kind of come together. And so I took these factors and I looked through social media, a content analysis. I compared a left-leaning newspaper, CNN, and their headlines and articles. And I looked at a conservative newspaper, Fox News, in the United States. And I looked at search terms to see how they relate to the diffusion of masking and those social network bonding aspects. And one of the things I want to show you is, like, up until March, Americans were worried about coronavirus. Don't buy face masks. Masks can't stop. So CNN and Fox are kind of basically at the same place right up here. And then as we get into the later period, as time moves on, CNN on this side and Fox on this side, we start to see similar messaging, but then Fox and CNN start to diverge. So they both talk about how the Surgeon General has changed his tune. Jerome Adams started to say, hey, masks promote freedom. If we all wear masks, we can go out and we can do things. But then on CNN, they're talking about, well, it's not maskers versus anti-maskers, it's public safety. But then on the Fox side, they start talking, they quote, various celebrities that actually are anti-mask. And then their quote from the vice president, kind of emphasizing that the decision should be deferred to governors. So the two newspapers started the same kind of with the government message. And then as the research showed that masks were good, CNN stuck more closely to that positive message on masking, whereas Fox News kind of went back and forth over time. And then I used a corpus analysis technique that is like digestive. You take all this language material. So this comes from the Now corpus. It's all sourced through the Bing News, over 1,000 websites from December 2019 to June 2020. We're talking over 645,000 or million words of text, and looking at masks right here is the central word, and seeing different topics that relate to my social network. So the first one, just seeing the rise per 10,000 words. So, here we're not really talking about masks, but now as the messaging and people are buying them, we start talking about them. They become more prominent, and then they sort of become normalized within speech around the coronavirus. So looking at our three bonding, bridging, and linking techniques: bonding, making masks to be shared across networks; bridging, sharing them beyond networks; and then the trust in government that can come when the citizens stand up and help out. We, as part of a country and part of a government, stand up and we support the government in its mission to handle this pandemic, which actually helps increase trust in government. But also anti-mask attitudes, of course, come at the same time, especially in a country like the United States, where that maverick spirit is really talked about. So for bridging, I looked across the months at making. So originally, this army of mask makers were making masks for healthcare workers to supplement a limited supply. And they were making masks for essential workers to supplement that limited supply. But then when that message changed that everyone should be wearing them, these kind, influential people who had already been making masks in our neighborhoods, so that bonding within families and within neighborhoods and with health workers, then started making masks for everyone. So bonding and then bridging the gaps here. And what we see is, December, January, February, and then all of a sudden making starts to come really high. And we've got people sewing masks, handmade, and we've got makers and sewers. So we start to see this really happening. And this is where they start making them for our healthcare workers and essential workers. And then here they're making them for everyone. And then our bridging here, donating and organizing, we start to see the same sort of thing. They start donating them. Now at this point here, the commercial interests get involved. We've also started, remember, sourcing PPE, personal protective equipment. So we're trying to make sure that everybody's getting this. So, the mask making army is still happening, but they are not necessarily the core of the army that's getting masks to everyone, but they're still involved. And what's really fascinating is that all of the different types of groups that were involved in this, associations, clubs, communities, companies, governments, members of clubs, and you had Chinese American Association members, you had student groups, prisoners making masks, so many different groups across society making masks for people outside of their informal networks, cross-formal networks. And why we see here that to protect others, this starts to come up in the discourse. To protect yourself is down there, but what it really starts to come up here. And this is where my paper ended. at this June point. I'm still collecting the data for and I plan to kind of extrapolate it after this, but this was my research at the time. Now, I wanted to look at the word anti-mask and how it happens in the data and what it links to. And the rise, as we start to see the government talking about masks, and then in April and May, we start to see the word, the government starts talking about mandating masks, making them mandatory by law. And that's when we start to see anti-mask really jump up here. And we get those anti-mask leagues. We had those in 1918. So again, we're revisiting history, something that we had kind of forgotten about that I learned by doing this research. I had no idea that we'd been here before. And so it was just fascinating to see. So going back to that slide with the pictures, I want to show right here, the symbol of tyranny and this sort of man making a mockery of the masks. And, the division between all of this mask making army and their, determination to help us. And they, believe, and they're influencing others to wear masks. Then on the other side, you have, the other group. So one of the main messages, of course, I really want to talk about with masks and what we continue to see is the idea that throwing statistics at people, a la Rogers, right here, throwing numbers at people and talking about studies is not necessarily always going to be the most influential thing to get people to adopt a behavior, but influential people adopting that behavior is much more likely to get people to change. So if you really want people to be doing what wearing the masks, wear your mask. On the other hand, when it comes to the US and the Wild West attitude, there may be some people it may be harder to reach. So thank you for your time. I see Michael saying hi, so I will sign off now. So thank you, everyone. And I will stop sharing once my cat gives me my mouse back.
Great, thank you, Heather, for sharing your presentation with us. One thing I appreciate about your work, in addition to the rigorous academic quality of it, is the topic that you've taken on. Masks is something that's become central to all of our lives, to our health, and certainly to our politics. It's become a very central issue. So the chapter is fantastic, and just the willingness to take on an issue like that, I really appreciate. So thank you for sharing your presentation with us. And now for another topic that requires quite a bit of courage, parenting, we'll turn it over to Melissa Milkie. So Melissa, whenever you're ready.
Hi there, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for having me and for this great, terrific conference. So the title of my talk today is Changing Times, New Sources of Parenting Stress and the Shifting Meanings of Time with and for Children. This is a conceptual piece, and similar to the prior presentations, it really thinks a lot about culture. And in this case, what are the meanings about time and how this was radically upended during the pandemic? How we spend our time, with whom we spend our time, all became, this really exploded during the pandemic. So in this piece, I'm looking at parents as a social category. And as we know, during the pandemic, many groups were at unique disadvantages for different reasons. And for example, the very young, the elderly, and people without resources really had many disadvantages. And for parents, I think this was also a unique time, and they had some unique experiences. So I wanted to focus on time and parents' time during the pandemic and think about what it meant and what it will continue to mean as we go forward in this decade. Also thinking about parents helps us focus a light on kids. And kids actually in the pandemic have been somewhat voiceless. They really have the least power in all societies, no votes, and have to be spoken through the adults that are around them. So it's important, I think, to think about children more so than maybe many societies have been doing. So in thinking about time and how the pandemic really upended parents' time, I focused on thinking about it in these three ways. First, time parents spend with children. Second, how kind of time that parents spend for children. And third, the time parents spend towards safeguarding their children's future. So I'll talk about each of these three pretty briefly, and then focus on some inequalities across these experiences. So in terms of time spent with children, we can think about parents' time with children in a sense. These aren't completely distinct from each other, these three types that I've listed, but as a type of quality time. Now, before the pandemic, pre-pandemic, many parents across the Western world, particularly employed parents, really wanted more time with children. They desired more time with children. They felt strained and stressed because of their lack of time with children. And of course, the kind of time that they ended up getting in their bubbles with their children was not probably the kind of time they envisioned. But what this led me to think about is that the qualities of time that parents spend with children became really intensified. So we know from research, from time use research, that time with children is ironically a little bit more stressful, particularly for mothers, than time spent apart from children. It's enjoyable, however, again, compared to time without children, and it's meaningful. So during the pandemic, as I mentioned, each of these became sharpened so that time with children became more stressful in some ways, because I'll talk about in a minute, the educational world became part of those bubbles. The institution of education folded into the home, and for some, the workplaces folded into the home. And children were not probably happy about these changes. For the most part, their schooling was not as they had expected in the past. It was, in most cases, worse. All kinds of things were lost for children. However, at least in the beginning, there was some possibilities for the enjoyment that parents and children felt in time together to be magnified as well. For example, you heard about, again, highlighted in the media, families cooking together, families trying new activities, outdoor things, board games, and so on. Also, the time that parents spent with children became more meaningful in many ways. It sharpened values around time so that parents really had to think about, and children too, and all kinds of people are thinking about, what do we value? What activities do we value? It forced all of this to happen for everyone. In thinking about time in a different way, not the time parents and children spend together, but time that parents spend for their children. And in this case, the work of raising children, raising the next generation. What they do for children is a lot, but their paid work is done in provision to provide resources for children. Paid work, as you know, became completely upended for some essential workers. It became very fraught with health concerns for others, for other parents. It came in the home. And as you might recall, that sort of famous BBC video where the dad has the little kids come strolling through the door in the middle of a video. Paid work and raising children clashed tremendously. So time spent for children was really upended. And again, unprecedented is that education systems and care that children had outside of the home all came together. And so this unprecedented work created a lot of stress for parents who never expected to be teachers, didn't expect that much care. So the whole village is basically cut off for parents. The bubble was a bubble that really cut off the important carers and teachers and community members from those children. Finally, I wanted to think about the time that parents spend towards safeguarding children's futures. And the time that parents spend for and with children is not just about present time, but it's about the future and the children's future. It's anticipatory, and it is investment in what those children will become. And so the pandemic, again, created for parents and for others concerns about the futures, from the hopefulness often of raising children and what they might become, to potentially fears about their future in terms of their health, in terms of their education, in terms of their potential job prospects, particularly maybe for parents with older kids in high school and so on. And the feelings here about that are marked joys that are steps toward children's progress through important life events like small ceremonies at schools and things like that, but also graduations, religious ceremonies, all the kinds of markers that are really important, not just for kids, but for the parents, and in terms of being recognized for by the community for their work in investing time in children. A lot of those were lost or changed dramatically. So those three types of time are important to think about for parents as an entire category, and for parents compared to other people not raising children, but also to think about within parents. There's going to be, of course, many different diversities of parents, and in particular, how these time inequalities, these time stressors are going to affect parents differently. And so it's easy to take a couple examples here, but just thinking about, say, low income versus wealthy parents, where wealthier parents had space, lots of technological resources to help with the time stressors that were part of raising children during the pandemic. And they had an ability to bring in extra help of some sorts, to leave a city, for example, and those kinds of things, to have flexible work. Another potential inequality that's come for parents in terms of time, we've seen in many studies, is comparing fathers versus mothers in terms of the time sacrifices they've made. Again, because of this unprecedented education time that became in the household. Many mothers around the world we see have been pushed out of paid work, left paid work, may not be able to go back to paid work. And those things have long-lasting repercussions as well. So in conclusion, I just wanted to pose the questions and to hopefully, as Mike said earlier on, point to some shards and shimmers of hope. But by asking these questions of a society, I think it's really important to shine the light on these questions. For example, how does parents' time with and for children and their futures matter in the society? What is the social response to the virus that it upended children, youth, and parents' lives? And will governments and businesses value care and invest in its future citizens by investing in the village, the larger community, the care, the importance of keeping like daycares and schools and those kinds of institutions safe and available for raising children. So thank you very much, and I will stop there.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the chat for folks in the audience if you have some questions and want to start typing those in or raise your hand. In the meantime, I just want to make a comment and say that I think I appreciate what Melissa's done as well for taking on this very important topic. I did say in my introductory comments that I'm not much of an optimist, but I do see these sorts of shards and glimmers of hope here and there. And maybe the biggest shard of hope is with children. And so it's very important the lessons they're learning today, because they're going to be in charge. Should I say when the next pandemic hits and bring back in that pessimism, but hopefully not. But they're going to be tomorrow's leaders. So that if there's optimism to be found, it's there. And I also really appreciate thinking about time, because that's something I think that's become meaningful for all of us. In some ways, it seemed very sped up. In some ways, it seemed incredibly slowed down. And I think this maybe typology isn't the right word, but this way of thinking about time with and for and safeguarding our futures, although you talked about it with children, I think we can think about it for a variety of other aspects of our lives, spouses, professions, whatever it is. So I really like your chapter. So let's open it up to discussion now. If anybody has questions, I hope that I have enabled the chat. I think so. Or raising your hands. And maybe while folks are thinking about that, I want to pitch one out for both Heather and Melissa. And whether or not you think things will be different after we recover from the pandemic. And I'm thinking less in sort of temporal changes and more in the potentials of deeper systemic changes, maybe with health, maybe with parenting. Will the kinds of lessons that we learn be something more structural and less ephemeral, do you think?
Melissa, I'll let you go ahead to that first.
But Mike, did you say when might this happen, or how might it happen?
Do you think it will happen? So assuming we get to some kind of post-COVID age, I think there's an idea that there'll be some changes in the short term, but do you think that the kinds of lessons we might have learned have the potential to lead to deeper systemic changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just, speaking from here in Canada, it's going to vary by governments and by workplaces, but I think it's a crucial question. And how will the response vary? And it's going to be different across the world, probably. But here in Canada, Chrystia Freeland just announced a couple of days ago about childcare and how there's going to be new investments in childcare. Thinking about, beyond children and parents, as you said, this is more applicable, but about essential workers and parents who are essential workers. But what are the safeguards, and will these people be more valued? It's their time, like I've been talking about here, but it's their health, it's their future. And, it takes courage for people to speak out and shine light on these stories of those that don't have power. And in a sense, being able to control one's time, being able to safeguard one's future is really a question of power. And are the societies that already have those little gaps available, those little shimmers of hope there that you could break through? Maybe it will show a more unequal world. Maybe because of globalization, people will be able to see how things have changed in certain worlds that can spread in a good way. Thanks.
So the question was about systemic change in the future.
Yeah, if you think the changes might be, we're going to see some ephemeral changes, no doubt, in the short run. But do you think there's the potential for a longer term, more systemic, dare I say meaningful, at least in the long term, sorts of changes?
So I see Mr. Dr. Guerrero has kind of asked the same kind of question, medium term, long term. When it comes to mask wearing, there are all of the psychological effects with masks and covering faces. There's also the fact that this pandemic in some ways is invisible. Most of the people that have contracted this disease, you can't tell. And so I think it's also exacerbated the tensions between individualism and collectivism. Societies that were moving more towards collectivism or more towards individualism, it's kind of polarized that. So I think in a sense, all of these factors have come together because you've got, religious aspects with face covering. You've got political aspects with, individual versus collective responsibility. And then you have this pandemic that people can ignore. I've often said, and I say this as a joke, but if COVID made you ugly, we would all be wearing masks. Do you know what I mean? It's such a silly thing to say, but if COVID was highly disfiguring, or if you saw people spitting up blood, I don't think there would be this question. I think the West would have adopted masks, and I think we would be like, wow, diseases are real. But, there are people that still don't believe COVID is real. And that's not just the United States. What's surprising is that these opinions are coming from, even collective nations. We're seeing some of these attitudes. We're seeing. So I do think there will be change. I don't think it's going to reach that 95% immunity rate that some of the doctors. So at the end of my paper, United States, by some estimates, had reached 55% compliance with mask wearing. It's an interesting statistic, but I'm not living there, so I don't see it. And that availability heuristic of who's around me would be probably bad for me, because I come from a very conservative area with a lot of people that supported the past American government administration. So I would not see it, but I do think there will be change. Systemic, as far as like responsibility towards others. I think because my paper is about local and informal networks reaching out as formal networks reach down, I think that tension is going to remain. And what worries me is that the next pandemic may be something that we can't ignore, and we may not be ready for it. But hopefully that mask making army will get those sewing machines out and change minds. So let's hope.
Yeah, we need the mask making army. We need Lady Gaga to wear masks. We need these celebrity influencers. We need all of these kinds of things happening. Somehow me wearing a mask doesn't matter as much as Lady Gaga doing it.
Exactly. So one of the sources that I had was these Gucci, these French fashion houses were making masks and giving them to essential workers. Who doesn't like a mask that matches your outfit? So anyway, I'll step back.
Agreed. Nazneen has asked a question here. I appreciate the discussion of children as voiceless. I'm wondering if Melissa has any thoughts on the obsession with learning loss, which often overlooks the social emotional health of children. Do you think our education systems are adequately incorporating the voices and needs of children?
Yeah, this is a great question. Thanks for that. I think that, to the extent that we value academic or, sort of learning of facts and things versus learning through social connection, then there has been this, utmost concern about are they learning the content? But really the problems with children not being in school and not having the content is dwarfed by the experiences that they're missing with peers, with teachers, with extracurriculars and those kinds of things that, one or two individual or even an extended family can't possibly provide. So I think to the extent that we, forget about the village and how important it is in raising children, we're also forgetting about the broader needs of children when we just think about the educational content that they might be missing. But yeah, I agree in the sense underneath your question is this really vital part about children's well-being that isn't discussed nearly enough in my view.
Agreed. It seems a lot of what we hear about children is mostly medical. The rates of contagion, the rates of survival, are they little super spreaders? It's that sort of thing more than are they okay, right? Aside from are they infected is one issue, but are they okay is something we're not hearing enough of. We have a question here from Adam, so I think I'm gonna unmute him. Yeah, I did. I hope.
Yes, my video still is not on, but that's okay. First, I want to, I got in the middle of Dr. Mello's presentation, and I just want to say that both Dr. Mello's and Dr. Milkie's presentations were fascinating. And Dr. Mello, you mentioned the Wild West environment, which sounds to me like a reference to my and my co-authors' Toxic Wild West. And we were, we cited you, I'm sure you cited us, but I wanted to ask you that particular aspect of the resistance to masks. Our piece goes into great detail about it. It's going to be in the next session. But you had said something that kind of caught my ear. I was like, you said that people seem to be more willing to wear a mask if, say, Lady Gaga or some celebrity promotes it. But what do you think about the people like the ones my co-authors and I were studying, the ones who were trying to take over the Michigan State House and who seem to believe that a gun can protect them from virus? And, what celebrities could possibly convince that group? Because it's almost like, having looked at this group of people, if they saw a celebrity that they admired wearing a mask, they would cancel that celebrity. They would just say, "Oh, you're like the Dixie Chicks and you support those liberals, so you're no longer a celebrity to us. You're persona non grata." What's your take on that?
My take on that is that I think there's always going to be two sides. There are anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers. I think the fact that COVID is invisible for a large percentage of the population dictates or allows this ability of denial. I definitely believe there are things you're never going to be able to convince people of. And I don't know if there is a celebrity. You're absolutely right. I do know that object lessons are sometimes the only way people learn. And it doesn't necessarily spread. They drank the Kool-Aid, but, oh, I hate homosexuals, but, oh, my daughter's a homosexual, now I'm okay with it. Or I've learned, I've changed. So I think there's always, just like in 1918, there are going to be the anti-mask leagues. There are going to be the people, my way, live free or die. I think that the disease would have to be different and it would have to manifest differently for people to buy in. But I think all of this has come together to cause the situation the way it is. However, let's imagine a disease that completely makes you ugly and has you spitting blood. There will still be people who say, there's lasers from outer space by the Rothschilds causing that disease and Pizzagate or whatever. So I am not optimistic that you will ever get, a 99% buy-in. And the shenanigans loving part of me likes that, but then the disease free, hopefully part of me, doesn't like it. So yeah,
sometimes it's a balance.
I appreciated your paper as well.
Sometimes it's a balance. As a sociologist, I'm finding the editor part of me, doesn't mind if it goes, I want to sell books, but the human part of me says, no way. And I think as sociologists, we face that a lot with inequalities, right? Oh, this is a great study, but I really wish it wasn't there for me to be studying in the first place. We have time. I'm going to squeeze in here one more question. So Mufti, I'm going to send you an unmute here. I think I did. You should be able to unmute yourself now. Or perhaps not. Okay. Well, Mufti, if you're there and you want to type your question into the chat, or maybe you want to send it, because we're just a little over time, I can send it on to the presenters as well. So that'll wrap us up for this session. I just want to thank again our presenters. Heather and Melissa, and also Sharyn and Susanna, although they were not with us, for your wonderful presentations today, for the audience for joining us, and a really interesting discussion. And if you stick around in about, I think it's in 10 minutes, we'll start our next session on social injustices. So thanks, everyone.